Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I see people are coming into the chat session as we speak. So I'm just going to give it one quick minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Candace Boyd-Wyatt. I am a professor of transportation and logistics at American Public University or American Public University System, specifically in the School of Business. And, oh, I'm sorry, that's my alarm. Let me turn it off. I wanted to make sure we started on time, so I had my alarm set. I forgot to turn it off. So I'm a professor at American Public University in transportation and logistics, and I specialize in research related to artificial intelligence and transportation. And as we all know, the new form of transportation is space. So I'm very excited for this upcoming presentation. We have some dynamic presenters today. So let me introduce them to you in the order in which they're going to present to you today. So hold on one second. I'm going to pull up their individual information. So our first presenter will be Melissa Rigney, and all of our presenters are from American Public University System, and she'll be discussing beyond science fiction as entertainment, why every English department should offer science fiction. Our next presenter will be Bhatna Weinbaum, also from American Public University, who will teach the original space explorers, space fiction writers in pulp magazines of Gernsback years. And then our next presenter is Jolene Mendel, and she'll talk about the Scully Effect, the X-Files and women in STEM. And then our fourth presenter will be Susan Lauman Thomas, and she will talk about science and survival in the sci-fi of indigenous writers. So as I said before, we have some dynamic presenters today. So I am going to turn it over to our very first presenter. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Candace. I do have some PowerPoint slides, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so first of all, welcome to our panel. My name is Dr. Melissa Rigney, and I am a professor here at APUS, and I've been teaching here for 15 years in the English department. So my presentation today will examine the role of science fiction literature in a post-liberal arts education system and how we can use science fiction as a way to connect with students in workforce-related majors, such as Homeland Security, supply chain management, and emergency and disaster management, among many others. My goals for this presentation are to show how English departments will have to respond to the gutting of liberal arts majors across the country, and how to adapt literature courses to the workforce training-based majors that are increasing in popularity. One method is to tie literature courses to the themes, concerns, and issues related to these majors. Science fiction is one genre that can do this. This presentation will review a short history of science fiction and focus on 3 subgenres that can tie directly into current workforce-based majors, such as disaster management, fire science, and homeland security. In addition to the gutting of liberal arts majors, English departments also have to address the falling reading rates, and especially for online classes, the short course periods. Here at APUS, all courses are 8 weeks, which severely limits our ability to assign long texts and increases our reliance on short stories, excerpts from longer texts, and poetry. Many college students also arrive in an English class with limited reading experience in fiction. In fact, quoting from DeWan, quote, "Books for pleasure are being supplanted by Facebook and Twitter posts." More and more students tell me they have never read a novel or full-length book, either for pleasure or for their college classes, and have very little desire to start now. As online classes become more popular, the length of class also shrinks. The typical 16-week on-ground semester has been replaced with 5, 6, and 8-week college classes, and I've even come across schools that offer 3-week mini sessions. The increased popularity of online classes and their short time frame reduces the opportunity to read full-length books. In addition, we have the usual fear of English, which has now morphed into a rejection of long-form reading altogether. unless it's a short or related to a student's future career goals or is packaged as a social media image or article. Science fiction at first glance does not meet the practical wants of today's college students, where majors such as logistics, supply chain management, and human resources management are becoming more popular. It is firmly placed in the role of entertainment and escapism. And for most students, sci-fi is television and film, not reading, and definitely not literature. In fact, data from Statista reveals that the average daily reading time for people aged 15 to 24 years is 8 minutes per day. So this now opens an opportunity for English departments to use the rich history of science fiction literature to not only introduce students to reading for pleasure and long-form reading, but also to connect with a popular genre in television and film, and with themes students are studying or learn about in other courses and in their majors, especially in an era of vocational type majors that are replacing the traditional liberal arts majors. This change is happening nationwide, and there is a shift in not just the role of higher education, but also which majors and departments survive long-term. At APUS, for example, traditional liberal arts majors offered are very limited. And these do include English, history, philosophy, political science, religion, and sociology. But missing from this list is traditional majors such as geography, music, chemistry, biology, anthropology, art, and linguistics, and also languages. Tech and workforce-based majors here at APUS and also elsewhere, because I do want to emphasize this is happening across the country. For example, the University of Wisconsin system has been cutting liberal arts majors, including English majors at some of their campuses. And so the workforce majors include retail management, and again, this is a list from APUS, but retail management, entrepreneurship, fire science management, supply chain management, human resource management, transportation and logistics management, and hospitality management. And that's just a few of them. There are more. The challenge for the English department here at APUS and at other schools is making reading and literature relevant to students in these majors and showing how literature can enhance their studies rather than just being a requirement that they need to get through. At the very least, English departments and literature courses can attempt some balance between workforce demands and liberal arts goals of preparing students to be a well-informed citizen in a democracy, the primary goal of institutions of higher ed until very recently. So while science fiction as a literary genre is considered a relatively new genre, it has a surprisingly long history with themes and ideas relevant to today's tech and workforce-based majors. Generally, it is agreed that science fiction emerged in tandem with early scientific discoveries in physics, medicine, math, and astronomy. Early examples, of course, are the famous Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, dating to 1818, and her exploration of medicine, medical ethics, religion, and creation. Jules Verne's novels include themes of exploration, travel, and even space exploration. H.G. Wells's novel, The Time Machine, includes themes of physics, exploration, and even social class conditions. And my very last example, William Rhodes, dating to 1871, as our very first example of WMD, or weapons of mass destruction, and a scientist who threatens to destroy the world with a toxic powder. Then, of course, we have George Orwell's 1984, which remains one of the classics of science fiction and is made even more relevant today with its depictions of constant surveillance and monitoring, and intersects with current issues of cancel culture, social media, data collection, and increased public reliance on CCTV and video. In addition, we have the current debate over freedom versus security, which is a major theme in Orwell's novel. According to Lautaro, quote, "How much did it get right in its predictions of a dystopian surveillance state where every word is monitored and acceptable speech is deleted, history is rewritten or deleted altogether, and individuals can become unpersons for holding views disliked by those in power." It turns out Orwell's predictions were very accurate. In light of this, today, modern science fiction gives English departments a way to connect students with 3 main issues that will impact their studies. Post-apocalyptic sci-fi, modern-day science fiction subgenres. We have 3 popular main themes in modern science fiction literature: the effects of climate change, which is also called cli-fi, the political and social repercussions of technology and surveillance, and finally, pandemic fiction. Climate change fiction, or cli-fi. So modern-day science fiction will mirror the social and political issues we face today. Climate change is one of the most popular themes in post-apocalyptic science fiction in both books and films. Cli-fi is growing in popularity and includes authors such as Jules Verne, Margaret Atwood, and Octavia Butler. In addition, we have J.G. Ballard's novels, which date back actually to the 60s, where he addresses the effects of flooding, fire, and rising sea levels on society. Cli-fi addresses the effects of climate change on humans and the planet, dystopian themes of survival and a race against time, natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, and fires, wealth inequality and corporate greed as causes and adding to the effects of climate change, social inequality, and climate change. Relevant majors here at APUS include emergency and disaster management, environmental science, fire science, government contracting, health sciences, and supply chain management. Next, we have pandemic fiction. This subgenre has a long history because plagues and pandemics are nothing new and are often documented across the globe and throughout history. Modern sci-fi addresses pandemics as lab mistakes or designed, engineered as a weapon. Pandemic fiction explores causes and effects on individuals and societies, and pandemics as threats to social order and security. Examples include Margaret Atwood's Onyx and Quake, which addresses climate change and a great plague. Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain and King's The Stand are also 2 popular novels with themes of human responses to a crisis, mutated organisms, and recovery from superviruses. Pandemic fiction, like climate fiction, addresses the post-apocalyptic future after a pandemic. Themes are dying, health in the body, government reaction or inaction, economic collapse, social collapse, security, and zombies. So zombie fiction is also pandemic fiction. We all know how popular zombie films are. Zombification is a metaphor for the loss of life and humanity in the face of a global disaster. Zombies are the result of an infection that is incurable and devastating and results in the total collapse of society. Relevant majors here again at APUS are environmental science, emergency and disaster management, natural sciences, public health, and health sciences. Lastly, we have, Lastly, we have tech and surveillance fiction. In terms of technology, this genre includes themes of virtual reality, the merging of the human body and consciousness with technology. Examples are William Gibson's cyberpunk novels, including Neuromancer, which addresses technology and the body and the preference to remain in a virtual space rather than in reality. Also something we're seeing more often. The novels are often dystopian. Humans are disconnected, preferring the virtual world to the real world. Themes reflect current issues with social media, its effects, and increasing disconnection from real life. Relevant majors at APUS include cybersecurity, information technology, public health, psychology, and space studies. So my next slide is actually just a suggested reading list. This list is articles related to the shrinking and elimination of the liberal arts majors. And if anyone's interested, I'm happy to forward those to you. So today's college students are selecting majors that reflect a move to a vocational education BA program for a tech-based workforce and the slow demise of liberal arts. Science fiction can help teach students that education is about imagination, creative thinking, and critical thinking. In addition, science fiction can be a route to a discussion of current events outside of social media and traditional media, divided political associations, and social media misinformation. Science fiction in many cases becomes science fact and can be both a warning and a celebration of what the future holds. English departments are in a precarious position today and may, like many programs across America, find themselves reduced. Again, I refer to the University of Wisconsin system that is canceling many liberal arts majors, including English, but again, it's just not limited to this big state system. There are many others that are following suit. The goal then for today's English department is to find a balance between liberal arts and its emphasis on soft skills, communication, analysis, and creativity, and vocational tech and workforce-based majors. Science fiction and its themes can help be that balance and that bridge between the workforce and the need for engaged and thoughtful citizens in a modern day democracy. And my last two slides are just my references. And again, if anybody is interested, I'm happy to forward these to you. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was really, really interesting. We're going to go directly to our next presenter, but as a reminder, if you have any questions, you're welcome to use the chat function or the Q&A function, and you should find both of those at the bottom of your screen. So next, I will introduce, well, I've already introduced, so I'll turn the floor over to Batya.
Yes, thank you. That's a hard act to follow, Melissa, but I'm going to talk about a particular writer during the Gernsback years. Hugo Gernsback was an immigrant from Germany who founded a series of science fiction pulp magazines from the 20s to the 30s, where a lot of people were experimenting with ideas that later became reality. And I've been reading a lot lately, a radical feminist writer, Shulmith Firestone, and she talks in The Dialectic of Sex about how there are two modes of thinking. One is the aesthetic mode and the other is the technological mode. And in the aesthetic mode, we practice conceiving. And then in the technological mode, we put into possibility. So the dialectic of cultural evolution is how we make the conceivable actually possible in reality. And she argues that the aesthetic mode of practicing conception of what could be is always way in advance of the technological putting things into possibility, into reality. And she gives the example of flying that actually started way back with the Greeks when the aesthetic mode was dominant. And even now, in the 20th and the 21st century, the ability to imagine and conceive is at least 50 years in advance of what actually comes into reality. So that what happens in the worlds of science fiction is that it's actually predictive of things that later come about and warns us of what might come about if we don't moderate what we actually create. And this particular writer that I'm going to talk about, Leslie F. Stone, she invented in one of her stories the fax machine, and then it later was invented after she created the idea in a story. And she also dropped out of writing science fiction and went into exotic goldfish collection and gardening once the atomic bomb was dropped, because she said that their ability to imagine was had actually brought bad things into feasibility and reality. So at a certain point in our American history, we took science fiction a lot more seriously than we do now. But because many of these stories from the Gernsback years were stories rather than full-length novels, I think that they can be read in a short period of time. I've taught them in composition classes, for example, and I do teach them in literature classes when I teach at other universities. So as a Jewish scholar and a multiculturalist teaching and researching in the field of ethnic literature of the United States, I became aware of this particular author in the Gernsback years named Leslie F. Stone. And her work appeared under a name cleared of any ethnic markings, as did the work of other Jewish writers such as Judith Merrill. And she was born a Rubenstein and lived her adult life as a Silberberg. But like Stanley Weinbaum's he's no relative, but he's a famous early science fiction writer. Like his main character, Ham Hammond in Parasite Planet and the Lotus Eaters, and Dr. Daniel Scott in The Adaptive Ultimate, and Captain Harrison and Dick Jarvis in The Valley of Dreams, as well as numerous other examples. Stone's characters were commonly consistently identified by the use of Gentile non-Jewish names. For example, in Men with Wings, a story where men come from another planet and kidnap women because of a shortage of women on their own planet, Kennedy is the name of the narrating character. And so she used Gentile characters as well as male characters to narrate her story. many of her stories. Nonetheless, many of the issues presented and themes discussed had to do with issues facing Jews, such as the breeding of an Aryan superior race and the questioning of dual loyalty of a race that had a national identity elsewhere, but took post in American government. The latter could have been an imaginary extrapolation from the known, the Gentile fear of employing Jews in the civil service, to the unknown. What would happen if somebody bred a superior race on Earth? Would the humans accept them? So by the mid-1920s, Jewish immigration had slowed down enough for a generation of immigrants to have established roots in America, and for a generation of American-born Jews to have come of age. And many of the science fiction writers in the pulp years were actually of Jewish descent. American Jewry was in the 1930s predominantly native-born, and the second generation had been called a cultural generation, scurrying between the two worlds of an increasingly familiar American society and a confining immigrant environment. One of the founders of American science fiction, Isaac Asimov, was of this generation, and he was inspired to write science fiction by a short story he read of this author that I'm talking about right now. Even those born here were still feeling alien, and it was clear that even having engaged in the struggle for Americanization that was reflected in slightly earlier works by American authors, such as Anzia Yezeriska's Bread Givers and Salome of the Tenements and Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans. The protagonist's goal in these earlier books of the first 3 decades of the century was to observe Americans so as to learn how to become one of them. But the theme or idea of the alien world oppressing an innocent victim remained in Jewish cultural production, such as in the film The Little Shop of Horrors, where we see a dramatization between a Jewish schnook and the Gentile world that oppressed him. And this was the same sense from which I found many Jewish science fiction writers, including Stone, to be extrapolating. And surely this sense of scurrying between the worlds that the second generation in the decade under examination felt could not have been any more clearly reflected than in the science fiction of the period. And in a journal that I edit, FemSpec, we publish a lot of science fiction of current ethnic minorities as well. And it's really a ripe genre for talking about relationship between different ethnic identities, because in many of the current writings about different planets, you have struggles between races, but they are, different aberrant groups, not necessarily of the distinct aberrant groups that we have on the planet Earth or in America right now. But one of the issues that came up in this early science fiction that I'm talking about right now was disappointment over false messianic hopes that found suitable outlets in the modern form of tale spinning in the mystical but unquestionable assimilated ways. Throughout their history, Jews have looked for heroic figures who could mitigate their suffering and lead them to messianic redemption. And this folklore was transferred to and recreated in America, where the savior, the fighter against evil, possesses magical transformative powers to fight selflessly for the good of all. By the day, for example, Superman poses as Clark Kent, and by night he flies through the world dressed in blue, yellow, and red, replete with a cape. And Superman was created by 2 of these early science fiction writers who were Jewish from the great hometown of Cleveland. Ultimately, the Great Depression deflated the balloon of belief in straight linear progression towards security and brought to the forefront the Jewish need to generate supernatural existences, and crimes against Jews in America increased simultaneously with the rampant unemployment, signs in the want ads specifically advertising for Christians needing only to apply. But perhaps, speculated these Jewish dabblers of these decades that I'm talking about in the science fiction pulp magazines, there were other worlds to which escape might be possible. Perhaps there were other races or species that were even more aberrant from the white Anglo-Saxon Christians, that Jews in retrospect might be included amongst humans rather than looked at as aliens themselves. Or perhaps the Jewish science fiction writers of the period were articulating a feeling of more commonness with the aliens that existed on other planets and with those in charge of the haven to which they had run when they left Europe, which was no longer safe. Hence the creation of sympathetic aliens by Jewish writers such as Stanley G. Weinbaum and Leslie F. Stone, one writing under a Jewish name and one not, in these pages of these magazines. In several cases, both their aliens deviated from the standard mode which Wells had set in War of the Worlds, where the frightening creatures were out to eradicate, enslave, or irrevocably harm inhabitants of this planet. The Wellesian view of aliens influenced the pulp writers from the first. Amazing, which was one of the earliest magazines called Amazing, that Gernsback had brought out in 1926. Both Weinbaum and Stone, in numerous cases, created aliens who were different, but not necessarily hostile. Aliens who could be intelligent and friendly and not necessarily disgusting, rapacious, and frightening to the humans with whom they interacted, a pattern that had been created by H.G. Wells. Perhaps this stemmed from their position as American Jews. So how did this particular writer come about? Lillian, Leslie's mother, was the first female screenwriter who worked for the Jewish Lubin Film Company. And at the time, Philadelphia was the Jewish-dominated film capital of the country. And Leslie's mother wrote for them, and then they moved to California, and she wasn't allowed to go. The mother wasn't allowed to go by the father to follow her career. So she turned to just writing a column, but nevertheless, she was active as a writer. And this whole world of the film company was reflected in one of Leslie's early stories called Cosmic Joke, which she published in January of 1935 in a pulp magazine called Wonder Stories. Most of these magazines are online, and you can find them in archives if you want to look for good science fiction stories to write into your curriculum. In fact, Leslie attributes her involvement in writing to her mother, and many of the magazines published Leslie F. Stone's stories because she had a male-sounding name. And there's a famous story where she met Joseph Campbell, who took over the Gernsback magazines at a party, and he was surprised to find out that Leslie was a woman. And there was a lot of flutter and conversation in the fan column. The readers' columns were very active in these magazines. And they defended her right to write as a woman. And I want to add to one of the earliest themes in science fiction. We started off with Mary writing about Frankenstein. Not only were there women writers in early science fiction in these magazines, but the theme of gender was always there. For example, even male writers were writing about robots being created to do house care and child rearing, and there was room to experiment with how gender was going to be formed when the early magazines were being written before they took the let's go down the technology only path. There was this whole area of soft science fiction, which is there to be tapped and read and taught about too. So Leslie's parents had a first child as a female, and they wanted the second child to be a male. And when she wasn't, her father was very disappointed. Leslie was very interested in science. She wasn't allowed to study science in school or in her college education, but she kept up her study of science through these magazines and through her writing of the stories. And so probably some of you have heard that phrase by Gramsci about organic intellectuals. And when you look at these early magazines, this was a place for organic intellectuals who were actually debating the real world of science well before the technical experiments were being performed by the field of science themselves. And certainly this is one of the few areas where women could function as organic intellectuals debating these topics and themes. But after 1 year of going to William and Mary, she met her husband, and he started to work for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And after that, they went to Washington, D.C., where her husband was a labor reporter. And so you can see infiltrated into a lot of her writing, a lot of political debating and analysis. And she also read a lot of mythology, like she read about the Amazons, and she created a planet in this story called The Conquest of Gola, where women were dominant, and male astronauts landed on the planet and were discovered to be different from the women who ran the planet, and there was a matriarchal society on the planet. That's only one of her female-dominated planets. I just recently brought out a collection of her stories, and you can find it on Amazon under that title, The Conquest of Gola and Other Stories by Leslie F. Stone. But it's a fascinating depiction of how not only was life being perceived as different but space travel was being perceived, and the idea of opening up completely different worlds to go to, not only in terms of relationships between nationalities and between what is human and what is alien, but between what is male and female, was definitely being thought about in these early magazines. So with that, I only have 1 minute, so I guess I'm going to wrap up and say that Leslie was truly an amazing writer, but there were other women writers. Lilith Lorraine was one of them. I want to encourage anybody who's interested in teaching history to look at these early magazines, because they reflect the political struggles of the times, including the reflection of the dictator of Hitler was in the stories as well. I pass. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you so much. There is a comment in the chat that says from Tammy, I think a better example for Orwell's vision of the prevention of literature relates more to the state of China. So what we're going to do in the interest of time is we're going to keep going, but hopefully we'll be able to get back to that comment and just make sure that we address any other comments that are in the chat. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to our next presenter, and that is Jolene. The virtual floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank APUS for hosting, for allowing us English folks in. I know as a child, I wanted to be an astronaut. I had posters of Sally Ride on my wall of my bedroom, and I learned that a lot of math and science was involved in becoming an astronaut. And obviously I've landed here in the English department. So this is the closest I'm going to get to space today. So I appreciate you all allowing us to be here. As both of my colleagues have shared, there's a real intersection in when we get away from traditional canonical literature of pop culture, literature, current events. One of my passionate areas of study is pop culture, both by how much of it is referenced by classical literature. So if you look at things, we can, the Thor character from Marvel is based on Henry V, and there's some of these really interesting connections, but also pop culture itself, I think, is worthy of academic study in a way that has long been ignored. So today I want to look at I guess we'll call this a digital text, which is the show The X-Files, which I'm sure I'm not the only big fan of here. And specifically a concept called the Scully Effect, which is quite fascinating here. So let me get my screen going here. There we go. Okay, so in 2018, the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media, 21st Century Fox, and Walter J. Thompson Intelligence published a study titled The Scully Effect, I Want to Believe in STEM. The study revealed that the show and the depiction of medical doctor turned FBI agent Dana Scully had a profound impact on women and girls' attitudes towards STEM, specifically on their ability to enter into careers in these fields, which were long dominated by men. In the study, almost 2/3 of the women respondents identified Scully as a role model. In addition, regular viewers were 50% more likely to enter into a STEM field than those who did not watch the program as frequently. Our analysis today seeks to look closely at the findings of the report to demonstrate the long-lasting effect The X-Files has had on women viewers, many of whom view Dana Scully as a feminist role model, as well as their point of introduction to the sciences, not limited to medicine, laboratory analysis, forensic pathology, which were depicted throughout the series. The analysis here will show how the Scully effect is both supported and undermined by the show itself, as Scully is the rational scientific mind in contrast to Spock's Mulder's more mystical beliefs. However, many of the plots she's involved in are stereotypical women's plots found in many previous shows and writings dealing with issues of pregnancy, rape, and motherhood. While the characterization of Dana Scully within the series has flaws, the character and actress Gillian Anderson inspired many women and girls to explore interests in STEM and to enter into these fields, undoubtedly making significant contributions to science and technology. The study of the Scully effect set out to understand why the gap between men and women entering STEM fields was still large, even when college enrollments between genders had largely equalized. The study found that depictions in the media, or lack thereof, had significant impact on majors, as these depictions were often the first or only introduction to the field for many viewers. According to the study, most viewers held a specific image of scientists in their mind, that of a lone, nerdy scientist in a lab coat, commonly portrayed as a mad scientist or socially awkward man, very often the villain in the story, not the hero. This portrayal reinforces the belief that science is a male pursuit, one that is held by many children, adolescents, and adults. Children start implicitly pairing men and math as early as age 7, according to some studies, and that's a bias that continues into adulthood. Characters like Dana Scully have long been discussed in changing attitudes towards sciences for women and girls, but much of this was relegated to anecdotal evidence. The 2018 study served to empirically prove what many had believed for decades, that the character of Dana Scully had a profound effect on women entering into STEM professions. The study queried 2,021 participants, women 25 and older, presumably, so those are women that had seen the show as it was airing originally, not streaming or whatnot, and divided the respondents into 2 categories, non/light viewers and medium/heavy viewers. While those in the latter category had more positive experiences than with the show than the former, respondents in all groups noted the importance of her character. Nearly 2/3 of the women who are familiar with Dana Scully said she increased their belief in the importance of STEM. 56% said that women should be encouraged to study STEM. And likewise, among women who are familiar with Scully's character, half said that Scully increased their interest in STEM. Most importantly, however, is the fact that the survey respondents overwhelmingly viewed Scully as a positive feminist role model. Among the women who are familiar with her character, 91% say she is a role model for girls and women. Nearly 2/3 of women that work in STEM say Dana Scully served as one of their primary role models. Among women who are familiar with the character, 63% said Scully's character increased their confidence that they could excel in a male-dominated profession. 9 out of 10 women who are familiar with the character say that she stands out as being a strong female character on TV. And then when asked to assign specific attributes about Scully, the words most frequently used were smart, intelligent, strong. And as you see in this word map that was published along with the study, there's lots of other words: scientist, tough, cool, problem solver, awesome, analytical. And these are all words that are sort of lacking gender or particular attention to the fact that she's a woman, which is interesting. We'll talk about in a minute. These findings show that the character was both a positive role model for the women and girls watching the show, as well as their possible entry point into STEM careers, which were previously depicted mainly by men in television and movies. Actress Gillian Anderson has commented on the Scully Effect. In a 2013 interview with the magazine Vulture, she talks about first learning of the phenomenon. She says, when we got a lot of letters all the time, and I was told quite frequently by girls who were going into the medical world or the science world or the FBI world or other worlds that I reigned, that they were pursuing those pursuits and because of the character Scully. And I said, yay. So now let's look at the actual character of Dana Scully from the show. So this character was immediately seen as something different from other female characters from the very first episode of The X-Files, which aired in 1993, which hopefully makes you feel as old as that makes me feel, because I remember watching that. She's a medical doctor with a degree in physics who had been hired by the FBI to rein in her new partner, Fox Mulder. In an inversion of traditional gender roles, it is Mulder who is interested in the supernatural and tends to lead with his emotions. Scully, in contrast, is the rational, science-minded skeptic who tends to keep her cool. She wears pantsuits and lab coats, not tight-fitting dresses or stilettos or other nonsensical outfits for women in these active professions. She's often found doing difficult tasks that women rarely had been seen in media doing, such as difficult surgeries and autopsies, as you see here in the bottom. She was often out there with the men, hiking through the mud, looking for clues and all that sort of stuff, and was not viewed as different for doing those. It's actually Mulder who is objectified throughout the show, often seen doing memorable feats, often without a shirt. In one particular episode, swimming in a Speedo, which apparently was a big thing at the day. But in episode after episode, Scully looks for answers to a problem to be found in rational science before accepting the possibility of the supernatural outcome. In the early seasons of the show, she's often the only woman in the room and has to contend with male FBI agents, local police, and officials. She has no problem sticking up for herself to her partner Mulder, assistant director Skinner, or even the notorious cigarette smoking man who we see lurking ominously in the background here in the screenshots. She's often depicted as almost genderless, or at least her being a woman is not of concern. And this is very different than shows that had strong female leads before this. We think of the women in the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Margaret Houlihan and MASH. Their gender is central to a lot of their characterization. Scully is almost never talked down to for being a woman. She's seen as on equal footing with the men. In fact, she's the one brought in to deal with crazy Mulder, and he's the one that's often treated differently. In numerous episodes, the only women she encounters are those who are victims of crime, supernatural or otherwise. In all of these scenarios, she is able to effectively assert her position and ideas. Scully's status as a feminist icon cannot be entirely separated from the actress Gillian Anderson herself, who's made a name for herself as a strong woman in Hollywood. She notoriously negotiated a higher salary after learning that she was earning half of what co-star David Duchovny was making. She's also been a strong advocate for equal pay for women in Hollywood and consistently calls herself a feminist in writing and in interviews, a term that a lot of women in Hollywood are not comfortable stating out loud. For viewers of the show, it can be difficult to separate the actress from the character, but it's clear that both are responsible for the view of Dana Scully as a role model for women. The character no doubt inspired many of the great characters on television that came after her, especially those in serialized crime. There would be no Olivia Benson from Law & Order, Tempest Brennan of Bones, or many other characters on TV right now without Scully. While Scully herself is undoubtedly a great feminist role model, many of the plots she was subject to were quite regressive, especially after the first season. In season 2, she is kidnapped by Dwayne Barry, a man who believes he has been abducted by aliens multiple times. In season 6, episode called Ascension, he brings Scully to a mountaintop where she is taken rather than him. She recalls later having procedures done to her, which is not uncommon in alien abduction stories. However, her memories involve her stomach being inflated, which of course symbolizes pregnancy, which you see here in this image at the top. The abduction trope is similar to rape, as the body is being used against the will of the individual. Therefore, Scully's abduction can be viewed as a violation common to many female characters in film and TV, not to downplay the significance of rape there, of course. When she returns, she finds an implant in her neck, a physical token of the violation seen here on the bottom of the screen. Subsequent tests reveal what the show calls branched DNA, meaning she essentially has alien DNA alongside her human genes. Throughout seasons 3 and 4, the government's plan to create a human-alien hybrid is revealed, and women largely are targeted as host. In season 3, episode 9, Scully encounters a mutual UFO network group who recognize her from the abduction. The group is made up entirely of women, all who have similar implants to Scully's, and there's the group right there. It is discovered in season 4 that all 11 women in the group have died from an unspecified type of cancer. Mulder notes that several of the women in the group have undergone infertility treatments, further reinforcing the idea that women were taken specifically to be used as hosts. Like these women, Scully will be diagnosed with cancer herself. Screen's not moving. Although she does survive. But the abduction MUFON women's plot shows a close relationship between the female body, fertility, and lack of autonomy. The women had procedures done to them, specifically their female organs, without knowledge or consent. Throughout the rest of the show, there's a subtle distinction about Scully's role as a caregiver and a mother, and that the loss of her fertility from cancer is of great concern. While this is a sensitive topic for any woman, it's important to note that there is little thought given to Mulder's permanent bachelor status. Even as a high-ranking member of the FBI, there is still an expectation that Scully will take on a more traditional role of wife and mother. Indeed, she does eventually become pregnant, but is forced to give up the child due to various forces coming for her and Mulder. Throughout the series, Scully is often written into scenarios where she is less than for either not being able to conceive or for not being able to raise her child traditionally. In conclusion, I just want to show a real quick clip here. This is only like let's see if it will load here. This is only about a minute long, but it goes back to this concept of Scully as this icon and the importance of the Scully effect.
In Comic-Con situations. I know that the character of Dana Scully was a physics major and inspired me to major in physics and thank you. I wanted to know if this is something you've heard a lot. I think there was something called the Scully Effect.
So there's actually, at the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about anecdotal evidence, and this was one of those moments that prompted this study to happen. So even though there are problematic elements of the show, it's clear that Dana Scully is an important feminist character that has profound impact on the women and girls that watch the show from when it first aired in the 90s till today. The Scully Effect is proof that just one positive depiction of a woman in a laboratory or surgical suite is enough to inspire countless others to embark on careers that they thought were not open to them. We can only hope going forward to see more Scully effects from the many positive and non-traditional female characters in film and literature today.
All right, thank you so much, Jolene. I really appreciate your presentation. So we have our fourth presenter next, so I will turn it over to Susan for our fourth and final presentation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the wonderful presentation of my colleagues, and I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion of science fiction. I'm going to talk about science fiction in terms of indigenous writers, and I'm going to focus on science and survival. The presentation will look at the science, indigenous, and Western industrialized in the genre in hopes of seeing two modes of scientific inquiry as harmonious and even promising. Survival is also covered as the writers present ways to get by, not just in a colonized land, but on a planet teetering on the edge of doom. The perspective offered here is one of a descendant of Slovenian, Welsh, and English immigrants. Indigenous sci-fi or native science fiction should not be a literary oxymoron, as per Drew Hayden Taylor, an Ojibwe from Canada. It should receive more attention as it has long been overlooked. The genre captures many aspects of traditional sci-fi, but also integrates elements unique to Indigenous people. It presents readers opportunities to see more than just the darkest traits of people in a colonized worlds. Two writers note the importance of this. Some say that native sci-fi makes sense because of a number of factors, including these: creatures falling from the sky. A widespread story is that Sky Woman fell through a hole in the sky, a hole dug by her husband, guardian of the Tree of Life. As she fell, she grabbed some seeds from the Tree of Life. Birds flying below made a great blanket of their bodies and caught her. They were unable to return her to the sky, but placed her on the back of a giant turtle. Sky Woman thanked the creatures and asked for their help. Animals brought her grains of dirt, which she placed on the turtle's back, and then she sang and danced. The grains multiplied and became home for the seeds she dropped. When she finished dancing and singing, there was land and plant life as far as she could see. That land was Turtle Island, also known as North America. This is one of many native stories that involve creatures falling from the sky. Sci-fi has contact with technologically advanced aliens, something native people have had for more than 600 years. The contact has not been a good story, as described by Nalo Hopkinson. Quote, arguably one of the most familiar memes of science fiction is that of going to foreign countries and colonizing the natives. And for many of us, that's not a thrilling adventure story. It's nonfiction. And we are on the wrong side of the strange looking ship that appears out of nowhere, end quote. Science fiction often describes an apocalypse, and indigenous people have endured that already as their lands have been overtaken and their populations reduced. Now they, along with non-native people, are looking at the possibility of global apocalypse. Time travel is a common element of science fiction. Concepts of time are different for many natives. Kyle White explains that for the Maori, quote, it is impossible to conceive of the present and the future as separate and distinct from the past. For the past is constitutive of the present, and as such is inherently reconstituted within the future, end quote. Native sci-fi scholar Grace Dillon notes that, quote, incorporating time travel, alternative realities, parallel universes and multiverses, and alternative histories is a hallmark of Native storytelling tradition, while viewing time as pasts, presents, and futures that flow together like currents in a navigable stream is central to Native epistemologies, end quote. A unique approach to time travel is seen in Hausman's novel, Riding the Trail of Tears, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. According to Bowdman, Cherokee writer Craig Street has been considered the first Indigenous author widely recognized within the science fiction community. His short story collections were repeatedly shortlisted for the Nebula Award and praised by many well-known writers. Red Planet Earth, published in 1974, was the first sci-fi magazine dedicated to Indigenous authors. In his story, A Horse of a Different Color, Strait portrays technology appealing, but also dangerous. TV has consumed people's lives, governing almost all their daily activities. Bowdman says, quote, the reader is drawn into a fragmented, plotless story where parentheses and capitalized letters break the narrative flow, and in-game characters reveal their own artificial nature, end quote. This story does not present a prospect of an Indigenous future, as the following message is presented repeatedly to the TV audience. I have seen the future and I won't go. Western industrialized science is not a source of excitement and anticipation for Native. It overcomes and dampens the Indigenous spirit. Blake Hausman's novel, Riding the Trail of Tears, shows a similar disdain for the technological advances of Western society. The story explores a virtual reality ride based on the Trail of Tears, in which customers can learn about Cherokee history directly by virtually experiencing removal. But the mechanism breaks down, stranding the protagonist, Tallulah, a tour guide of Cherokee descent, inside the game with upset tourists. The monitors on violence levels are disrupted, options for determining events are unreliable, and mysterious little people inhabit the mechanism. Readers are presented lessons of relying too much on technology while they are experiencing the historical removal of Indigenous people. Because time travel here is not via a time machine, but virtual reality, Brown Spears says the novel isn't fantasy, which might seem to erase the suffering for those along the trail, and which is, quote, less useful for contemporary Indigenous peoples who have no such time machine to improve their own lives. Instead, by telling a Cherokee story that is simultaneously set in 2 centuries, Hausman offers a new model of resistance and empowerment in the face of historical trauma and spirit, end quote. While Western industrialized science is shown in Indigenous sci-fi as threatening, Native sciences are often shown as promising. According to Dillon, there is much exploration of Native science in Indigenous sci-fi. Native scientific literacy show up under a number of labels, including Aboriginal resource management, Indigenous resource management, and traditional ecological knowledge. These modes of responding to resources, says Dillon, quote, re-energize the natural environment while improving the interconnected relationships among all persons, and that includes animal, human, spirit, and even machine, end quote. One short story I'm going to talk about is Drew Hayden Taylor's Mr. Gizmo, which looks at the interbeing of humans and things. Indigenous scientific literacies include a wide range of activities, according to Dillon, such as agriculture, physics, electronic, and pharmacology. Much Native science fiction stresses the important role of storytelling, as this is a way scientific literacies are preserved and passed on from one generation to the next. Looking at ways of preserving a culture is the focus of the remainder of this presentation. Louise Erdrich's novel, Future Home of the Living God, presents a dystopian landscape wherein evolution has reversed itself. In a cloud of uncertainty, creatures are returning to their former states, such as a saber-toothed tiger-sized cat who kills a dog, and humans are born deeply flawed, Pregnant women are rounded up and imprisoned, so their children who are hoped to be intact can be kept, and so these women can breed future children with preserved sperm. The pregnant protagonist, Cedar, who is racially mixed, records the story's events in a journal for her unborn child. Her native community tries to protect her as the non-native society collapses. Two key concepts that Erdrich tackles are how motherhood puts women at risk and how important it is to get reliable information when disaster hits. The uncertainty that permeates this novel is striking. Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse occurs in the Southwest following a mass extinction and a great flood. The protagonist, Maggie, hunts monsters in this world that is populated by her people, protected from the flood by a great, beautiful wall. Miller notes that the, quote, post-apocalyptic landscape of the novel literalizes the consequences of unchecked resource exploitation and suggests that in the face of climate catastrophe, national boundaries seem irrelevant, end quote. Roanhorse asks us to, quote, reject these colonial ideas and instead reimagine space, both outer and inner, from another perspective, one that makes room for stories that celebrate relationship and connection to the community, coexistence and sharing of land and technology, the honoring of caretakers and protection, end quote. Roanhorse demonstrates in Maggie's superpowers and spirit the concept of survivance, which is more than just survival. It is a kind of resistance bent on not just getting by, but on working to right things in a world out of balance. This bigger than life protagonist presents an ecofeminist approach to making it in an environment that seems doomed. Drew Hayden Taylor's short story, Mr. Gizmo, presents a native teenager who lives with his grandparents because of his parents' alcoholism. His grandmother has just died, and his grandfather has started drinking after years of abstinence. The youth feels there is no alternative for him except suicide and sits in his bedroom, aiming his grandfather's pistol at various things in the room. Taylor explains how things have spirits, how they observe humans and they talk to each other. The youth's toy robot, Mr. Gizmo, launches a conversation with the teen. He describes suicide and the long-lasting impact this teenager's death might have. Here, the emphasis is on the future, a future of the tribe, not just of an individual in it. Hope is offered in an unusual communal way. The apocalyptic themes of science fiction are brought close to home in many indigenous works as they examine the anthropogenic elements of life on Earth, where human activity has radically and irrevocably changed the planet and our future on it. In Moon of the Crusted Snow, Rice presents an Ojibwe community that is struggling to survive on the marginal northern land they have been moved to. The petro-energy infrastructures to the south have collapsed, sending the non-natives into chaos and madness. The tribe's efforts to maintain calm and to rely on community and native survival skills are disrupted by the arrival of a non-native who violates tribal norms. The work sets forth a number of sci-fi traits described by Dylan, including contact with aliens, native scientific literacies, apocalypse, and survivance. Storytelling is an important feature of Moon of the Crusted Snow as a way of preserving and transmitting cultural values and norms from one generation to the next. It takes center stage in Erdrich's novel, since the format is that of a journal Cedar writes for her unborn child. Excerpts from that journal are shown on the slide. Language is a tool for reaching into the future, as well as for preserving the past and getting by in the present. Science and survival are two elements of indigenous sci-fi that distinguishes this writing from non-native works. As Roanhorse states, quote, "We are rising from the apocalypse, folding the past into our present and writing a future that is decidedly indigenous," unquote. This wraps up my presentation. I have 2 pages of works cited and would be glad to share those with you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Susan. As I said at the beginning, this was a dynamic panel. I mean, all of the different topics, and all of the presenters from American Public University just really gave us a lot to think about. So I'm looking through the chat. I don't see any questions, but this would be our Q&A time. So if you have a question, please, please, please go ahead and enter that into the chat. Jane, I couldn't agree with you more. Jane said phenomenal work, fantastic presentations, and I agree 1000%. So if there are questions, please go ahead and enter those into the chat. And in the meantime, I'll ask a question for any presenter to answer. And that is, what do you think the future of your particular genre or field will be when it comes to space and science applications?
What field? You mean the field of science fiction?
Yes.
I think there's always been a huge connection between science and science fiction. And I think also science fiction creates a wonderful bridge between people and science. And science fiction often works out our collective social concerns and fears. I look at pandemic fiction or the zombie movies, which I mentioned very briefly in my presentation, and really just a cultural way of working out a lot of our fears about the present and the future. And the rise of sci-fi fiction is also, it dates back to the 60s, where a lot of what's happening today was predicted in science fiction. And so it's hugely relevant because it's us exploring our concerns and our fears and our sort of collective cultural fears about what is happening around us and the role of science. And even today in the news, we're looking at all these debates about, just the vaccine and the role of science and who to trust. And science fiction often creates a way for us to work through and discuss and analyze a lot of these issues.
And I also think, as we're seeing from all of our panelists here today, there's a big move to really change the canon of literature to make it more accessible to folks. And I say that as somebody with a degree focused on Shakespeare. So that's, tough waters to wade into for some of us. But also, I think as more folks come into STEM, come into other careers, they're being brought in by these wonderful works. We have to then be open to exploring them, giving them academic treatment, allowing students to read and write on these non-traditional texts. And these are the texts, we love classic literature, but these are the things we pick up and read for fun. These are the things that when you're at the airport, you grab the Erdős novel, not necessarily the Chaucer and things like that. So these are literature is a joy and should be not something that students see as a punishment, something that they are excited to engage with. And I think that's something that our field has been and will continue to grapple with.
So I think that in terms of the evolution of the genre, in the beginning, there was so-called hard science fiction, and then there was the evolution of the field of soft science fiction, and that's got to do with social relations among the people on the aircraft instead of just how does the aircraft get from one planet to another. And I think that part of the field the fiction writing of science fiction has just mushroomed and taken off, and it's going to completely keep revolutionizing the more technology revolutionizes. So that's my 2 bits. And the second thing I wanted to say was during the pandemic, or the first year of the pandemic, the most popular movies on Netflix were the ones about viruses taking over cities or towns. And so those are the apocalyptic type science fiction genres that we've been talking about. So I think that more people are beginning to see the value of watching or reading what they had poo-pooed before as beneath them, and they're turning to them for some reality checks and to relieve some anxiety so that our genre gets upgraded as the aircraft takes off.
I think that's absolutely true. And I like the fact that we decided, the 4 of us decided that the social issues that are facing us are really connected with science fiction. And to me, it is really, really helpful to understand that science fiction is addressing incredibly, terrifying issues like climate change and very scary issues of women's reproductive rights and treatment of different races. And I think that it's a really, not just a fun and escape thing, but it's a very functional therapeutic genre.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ladies, there is a question from Sarah Walter in the chat. Let me read it because I believe it's a two-part question. It says, we all know that sexism, racism, etc., has always been prevalent in sci-fi as well as everywhere else in the world. Question one, how does everyone feel about the progress that has been made in the areas of sci-fi in the last couple of decades? And question two, is it enough, or is there still a great deal of progress that needs to be made in this regard?
Well, there always has been progress, but about 20 years ago, I founded a feminist science fiction journal, and now there are scholars, feminist scholars coming of age, not ever realizing there was a period when people didn't study the early science fiction writers who were women. So they're taking as normal that these women existed in reality, whereas our generation of scholars were digging them up and putting them on the platter. And so the theories of science fiction as a genre are changing once we're realizing that these writers questioning gender were in fact always there. So whole new ways of looking at the genre have been opening up, and we're continuing to open them through our journal. And now the mainstream genre journals are looking at feminism and race and class also. So we think there's been progress, but there's always room for more.
I think we have to be careful of a backsliding as well. For my presentation, I watched way too many episodes of the X-Files. My husband didn't complain about that. But there are even just very subtle things. You know, in the early seasons, Scully is wearing boxy coats and flat shoes. And if you watch the reboot they did, she's in 6-inch stilettos and pencil skirts. So it's that seems like a minor detail, but it's also going back to the male gaze. It's going back to fulfilling traditional gender roles. So I think we have obviously not, to answer Sarah's question, not enough has been done. And I think we also have to make sure that that once the box is checked, we're seeing with many things in our world, those boxes can be unchecked. And we have to just make sure that with all sorts of literature and pop culture that we don't, I think there's these wonderful, great characters, but why do they have to wear, latex cat suits to be on the spaceship with the men who get to wear regular pants and shirts? And, some of these things, when we start looking at, there's definitely more to do in that regard.
Or why was the first female captain of Star Trek a size 4? That's been raised. Yeah.
And I think we need to make sure that in our own English department, that we make sure that we address issues of indigenous writers and
Absolutely.
And female writers, and that we have a broad spectrum of literature for students to look at and get excited about.
Mm-hmm. Within each course, not just separate courses on indigenous writers and women writers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Agree.
Absolutely. Well, ladies, I'm looking at the time. We do need to wrap up right at 2 p.m. Eastern. We have maybe 2 minutes. I can't even do the math. We have about 2 minutes left. Let's see if there are any other questions. I have one from James Park, so hopefully we can answer this really quickly.
We're trying, James. We're trying really hard.
Yes, I'm trying really quickly. Let me read it. It says, this session is a great look at our modern culture through the expression of literature. Literature and art can make great expository use of evoking an examination of the world around us. I would enjoy a course that had this focus, and it would be a nice compliment to STEM students. Here's the question. Is that something easy to implement in the school?
So write to the dean and the provost, and that would make it easier.
Okay.
It's something that we have put together some ideas about, and we didn't get to fly this time, but we're not done. We'll come back.
I am going to pitch a science fiction course for our English department, so we'll see what happens.
They like that.
Very good. Very good. All right. So we've got all of 45 seconds. Any final comments in 45 seconds, because we're going to literally shut off, or should we go ahead and just say our goodbyes now?
Melissa, I wanted to know if you'd looked at the resources of the SFRA, Science Fiction Research Association, because they have a lot of courses on file and different ways people have taught science fiction around the world.
I would love to. Can you send me the link?
Sure, it's just SFRA. I can send it to you.
All right, perfect. And with that, that will be our last comment for this afternoon. Thank you again to all of our participants. Thank you again to our panelists. And again, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.